Mr. Zimmerman?
Thank you. I wanted to take tonight and bring forward some more information regarding our proposal for this upcoming year. We do have a theme of sustaining our future for excellence and investing in our competitive edge, and we'll be continuing with that theme throughout our presentations as we move through this process. I'm going to be doing an overview. We're going to be taking a look at revenues in a holistic fashion. Expenditures, holistically, we'll be going much more in depth into those areas in other presentations. The drivers of the budgets of the request, and then some information on the budget process, followed by instruction, doing presentations regarding the specific areas, but that instruction will cover multiple nights. But we'll be doing first section of instruction. So just as an FYI, we will be posting this presentation to the web here shortly. So hopefully by tomorrow afternoon we'll have this posted up on as part of this agenda from this evening. One of the things that we have looked back at over the in this last budget cycle is where we were and where we are now. If we take a look at our revenues in particular in the same way, from 2008, 2009, we had just over 12,500 students. If we look at our overall revenues, 67% local revenues, almost 31% state revenues. Federal revenues, they haven't changed much from year to year. If you look at the difference that we have in 2015-16, state revenues as a proportion of our overall budget have declined by 3%. And what has made up that difference? Local revenues have made up that difference. At that same time, we've had nearly 1,000 more students over this same time period. If you look at the state revenues that are associated with this, we're 45.7 in 2008, 2009, 45.5 in 2015-16. Less revenues from the state for 1,000 more students, excluding the impacts of inflation. One of the very significant factors of our current situation is the failure of the state to fund its share of education for Albemarle County. If we take a look at per pupil state revenues, these are our actual received revenues, and we control these in constant 2008 dollars. We received a bit more than $3,600 in state revenues per student in 2008, 2009. We're more than $620 per student down for this upcoming request. How does that translate into actual dollars, funds that can go out there and impact upon our school divisions? If you look in 2009-10, if the state contributed the same amount that it did in 2008-9, it could have funded Brownsville in its entirety. All operational expenses from Brownsville. Teachers, principals, assistant principals, custodians, office staff, all of it. 2015-16, if the state had continued funding at an equal level as to what it did, we'd be nearly $8.5 million more revenue. That would fund all of Burley, all of Meriwether Lewis, principals, assistant principals, teachers, teaching assistants, office staff, custodians.
So basically what you're saying is that we've been losing one or more entire school worth of revenue from the state every year since 9-10.
Has it been just the state not appropriating more, or is it our enrollment is growing?
It's a combination of two, but their per pupil numbers have been dropping.
So as they pulled, for example, positions out of SOQs that they used to fund, then that contribution to us drops.
And they don't fund inflation. They fund inflation on only a portion. It's only at 40% of what the actual inflationary costs are. There are a number of things that the state does to minimize its contribution to localities to fund education. And we can really see the impact of that when you control for it in this way. The next area we want to take a look at is expenses, and this is another slice of our overall budget. It is not really presented in this way, except for during this discussion. If you look at our overall expenses, in general, what do we expend our money on? For the first time ever, we're expending 85% of our dollars on our human capital. We are a very personnel-intensive industry. Our dollars are going toward people, excellence, motivating, retaining, attracting quality personnel is a primary need of this division. 85% for the first time ever. Operational dollars of the next one, $20 million, but that would represents 12% of our overall request. And then we'll also look into transfers as part of this presentation as well. That's 2.3%, a little bit less than 2.3%. So the next slide we'll go into is just personnel. And this does not show up very well on our overhead. We look at personnel expenses by location. We've done a lot of breaking out of things by location, school-based versus non-school versus department-based. School-based personnel, nearly 85% of all of our personnel are school-based. So our $142 million, $120 million is people that are housed at schools. You look in those school pages in your budget book, those are the people that we're counting right here. Everyone that's housed at a school, from the custodian to office staff to teachers, teaching assistants. Department-based staff, we'll cover those in the departments as we're bringing those forward in future presentations. But the largest group of that is in transportation, bus drivers, mechanics, maintenance workers associated with building services, and some departments that we'll be covering tonight that are in central office, covering instruction and other areas. But if we took a look at school-based staffing per 100 students, you've seen this slide before. We've updated it with new information as far as location of all staff. As a division, even though we have made reductions over these last few years during the recession, as a division we have really made a concerted effort to ensure that staffing at school is the least impacted of all staffing. While some changes have taken place from 2008, 2009 to 2015, 16, we've seen an increase in our free and reduced lunch populations. So we have seen some reductions in services that we've delivered over time. But overall, we've really made an effort to keep our school staffing at a high level. On the non-school staffing, that is where we have made the most significant reductions across the organization. And if you take a look at 15, 16, that school staffing does include the additional positions that we have in there for transportation. We have 6 positions in there for transportation and half a position for behavior management. The next area that we wanted to look at is the operations area. Represents about 12% of our overall budget, $20 million. $4.6 million is school-based. This is formulaically driven. As more kids come to your school, more money flows to your school by formula. And those school-based monies, the expenditure of them is determined by the principal along with their staff and community. And department-based expenditures, 76%, $15 million. But there's a little bit more to that story than seeing $15 million in operations. We took information that we could identify readily as fixed operational expenses across the division and pull them out specifically, the large ones. And here's just a quick list of the things that are covered in that $15 million. Fuel, electricity, our payment for our regional special education program, that if we didn't make those payments, we would actually cost more to operate it ourselves. Heating services, diesel lines, water, sewer, refuse removal, travel between schools for our staff. We're mandated, we have to pay it. You know, if you're traveling between schools, we have to pay that. Insurance, telephones. You also see some credits down there. So when we see fuel costs, you'll also see some credits associated with it. Those are the payments that local government makes to us. So we want to make sure that we're going to cover all of, we're going to be truth in advertising. These are our fixed expenses, and we're getting some credits back for our fixed expenses as well. That's $10 million worth of things that we don't really have a choice of whether or not we have these expenses or not. You're going to have them if we offer transportation. We're going to have them if we run a school division. That's not quite all of it. We just take a look at all of our departmental operating expenses over $140,000 and think about whether or not we place a significant value upon them. Staff development, it's a focus of our division, improving staff development over this next upcoming year. The next larger areas are all associated with maintaining our buildings. And then supplies, ed and rec supplies, those go out to schools from some of our central office departments. So there's another significant chunk in a very, very small number of areas that are associated with that $15 million. So if you look at this, more than half of our operational budgets are associated with fixed expenses across the division. The additional $3.4 million that we just identified, we do have a very small amount, relatively, of the departments that have some other operating funds that are associated with our operations. Doesn't include things like copiers, things like paper, things that are associated with running the other components of professional development. And we can cover those as we look at our departments overall. And then keep in mind, $4.6 million of school-based money that is formula driven by the number of children in each school. The final area that we'll cover today is transfers in an overall way, about $3.8 million. And these are the specific line items that add up to that nearly $3.8 million. Comprehensive Services Act, we're seeing a fairly substantial increase in that for this upcoming year. There will be additional information presented on that tonight. Computer technology, media services, we do pay for school resource officers. If you do take a look at this, we do not have money built in there for the Bright Stars transfer. We took that out in this last budget cycle. It remains out for this budget cycle. If we look at the drivers for the superintendent's overall funding request, our directed mandates were $3.6 million. We're doing half-year salary, not the full year that we identified as market driven, but this request includes half-year salaries. We do see a substantial increase in our health insurance. Two components associated with that. One is that we're seeing about a 9.6% overall increase. Then we also have our UVA enrollees and brand new enrollees in health insurance. It adds up to close to $900,000 in those two areas.
I want to also remind you on this one that this is predicated on us removing spouses who meet the criteria for not being on our insurance. So this could be higher if that action had not been one that
It would
we're
be
recommending forward.
over 16% increase if we did not do the spouses.
So you were recommending that we do that?
What's included is that the spouses that are employed elsewhere who have insurance that meets the criteria for appropriate insurance would be removed. And I think we will likely see some dominoes from some others in the area as UVA has taken that step.
I think that's probably one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in the overall numbers of new enrollees as part of this as well. Smaller employers moving into the same area. CSA, again, a big increase. That's the Comprehensive Services Act. We do have significant growth costs that are built into this request. So overall, we have a revenue increase of just under $3.4 million. We have directed mandated expenses of nearly $3.6 million. Our revenue does not even meet the directed mandated expensing increases. And then on top of that, we have our growth expenses. A very few dollars towards restoration and a very few dollars towards system improvements. So overall, our funding gap is $3.1 million at the current time. If you look at our overall request, our enrollment growth is 2.3%. Our student body grew 2.3%. Our revenues didn't grow as much as our student body grew. Our market growth is identified was 2% for teachers, but we're only asking for half a year in this request. 2.3% plus merit for classified, we're only asking for half a year in this request. Health insurance is increasing by 9.6%. If you just think about an estimated inflationary increase across this year, those estimates are coming out at about 1.5% for this upcoming year. We're not building anything for inflationary increases in this other than the specific increases you've seen in here. So overall, this request is a very modest request of 4.05%. When you take into account all of the factors that are driving this, this is a very modest expense increase. However, our revenue growth is less than 2.1%. The key takeaway we're trying to communicate here is that additional revenues are needed to maintain the quality and excellence that we expect this division to maintain. Wanted to just provide you with a quick overview of our budget process. We do go through and look at this every single year. This is the process that we follow. We look at all of our staffing. We ensure that we're balanced to the 100th of an FTE from year to year. We look at every operational budget. Operational budgets are either no greater than they were last year or less. All of our schools are formula driven based upon enrollment projections. Then we look at new personnel parameters. The salary increases that we are discussing in terms of joint boards, the health insurance components, the VRS rates that are applied, all of the things that are associated with calculating the dollars that are applied. In this instance, we do have a VRS rate that's slightly lower than we had last year, and all of those are reflected in our request. Then we have additions to the budget: growth, any other mandates, and new resources, which are very, very small in this area, and thus yields the superintendent's proposed request. And you'll see some of that as we're coming forward with departments in future budgetary discussions. And wanted to see if there were any questions on the holistic view of our revenue and expense as they are currently, knowing that they will be changing in these next few months.
This is a little different approach to what you usually get from Mr. Zimmerman at the beginning of the budget cycle or the funding request cycle. One of the reasons why he's been able to really pinpoint things more specifically such as how much of the cost that we have are fixed expenses and those kinds of areas, is because of the change that we've made in the way that we've set up the book, so that you're able to see more by location where expenses sit. So I think that for me, really clarified some areas that perhaps have been questions in the past that either the board that has had, community members have had, or even the Board of Supervisors, as to where do those expenses sit that really take up, whether it's operational expenses or personnel. And I do think that the shift in the format really has helped us with that. So I want to thank you again, Mr. Zimmerman, for your work on that.
Are there questions for Jackson at this time?
Just one, that the 9.6% increase in health, that's the combination of new people coming from, or is that a rate increase?
That's actually the rate increase. For the last couple of years, we've been using balances that are available within the health insurance fund to partially offset board contributions. And so we've drawn those balances down as much as they can possibly be drawn. And so the 9.6% sort of reflects a catch-up to what the board should have been funding with recurring dollars, plus a very small amount necessary to replenish balances within that health insurance
I guess my
fund.
question really goes to, if we had kept up, what would have been the marginal increase?
The marginal increase would have been probably under 7%.
It's still high, given health care costs nationally.
But that's sort of you know, it's one of those things where it depends on what rate you had funded previously.
Right, but it does not include the new.
It does not. That
Immigrants
9.6% does not
from
include the new immigrants from UVA
Right.
that we knew about very late in the budget process,
Right.
but we were thinking we were going to receive some money associated with those and did not. And then there's also 16 new enrollees above and beyond what was anticipated in terms of growth of staff.
I think it would be helpful if we had a chart that showed the increase over the last, say, 6 or 8 or 10 years, to put that in perspective. I think if you look at it, how much it's gone up over the last 8 years, it's much more in line with
Right.
low.
In general, our health insurance increases have been very moderate relative to market. This is one year in which it is higher than most market predictions are.
And part of that is related to being self-insured. So if we have a year where we have higher than expected expenses, that will translate forward and have some impact.
But most of this increase, the 9.6%, a large component of that is because we've not kept up with recurring funding as we should into the health insurance fund.
So we'll
Do
take
we
that
have
as
a
a question as
catastrophic, I
well.
mean, we self-insure, I do understand that, but do we have a catastrophic policy on top of that?
We do purchase from reinsurers.
Reinsurance, okay. Sorry, I've been in the weeds,
Well, I was going to that. I remember in our joint meeting back in the fall, there was a breakout. There was a chart that showed, I had that in front of me, the proposed, because we're doing plan changes and the spousal piece coming up. And I do remember there being a chart that showed the dollar impact of those changes. I'd love to have that.
We will
just
ensure that those are
supplement somewhere.
that those are followed up with the next meeting.
Because that has come up in conversation to be able to say the savings of that chart broke out, joined the spousal piece, what that gained, what the cost of that was.
And we did provide that at one point. I think the HR staff has it. Okay.
I believe Ms. Jerome will be doing a presentation regarding compensation and benefits, and we will make sure that she covers health insurance in greater detail during that presentation.
thank you.
So remind, was it county policy was this something we did jointly with the Board of Supervisors, that we would do the 2% increase only on 6 months versus 12?
At the joint meeting in December, at the CIP session, after the CIP conversation, we had a conversation about, in the 5-year plan that the Board of Supervisors was approving that day, it was calling for the half-year increase, not the full year. At that time, the school board raised it was basically consensus that we were interested in a full year. But that consensus didn't grow to the point of changing it for the funding request
I was
reports brought
directed
forward by Dr.
to
Moran and Mr.
provide it at the half year
By whom? This body?
by the
or
joint boards.
The joint board.
That Tom and I both asked that question. Remember, we asked that question.
Now, it was also discussed in that meeting, the possibility, which I hope has been explored and I presume will come forward at some point, that because of these health insurance changes, that if a raise did not go into place January 1, that it would increase or decrease net take home in October, November, and December, and that there was potentiality of one-time money being used to offset. So that, I'm presuming, will come up at some point.
We included that in the presentation to you, that there are 3 items that could be impacted depending upon what fund balance is available. One of those would be to provide some gap support for folks on their insurance between October 1 and implementation of a half year.
But there was no, I mean, there was not interest beyond this board in doing a full year.
And I would just say, as we get deeper into the process, and we somehow find that we'd be able to fund, say, an extra 3 months to start in October instead of January, it'd be incumbent on us to request a joint meeting with the board of supervisors so that we can discuss that before we set our funding request on.
And I believe it was the same, just as Dr. Moran brought forward to us, it will be likely brought forward by Mr. Foley, a similar set of options to do that same type of one-time piece for those 2 or 3 months.
Just so I have a handle on the dollar amount, I'm looking on page A17. If we were to implement 12 months instead of 6, we would have to add about $1.3 million
Yes, sir.
to the budget
For compensation.
for a
that's
full
correct.
12 months at 2%.
Yes, sir.
That's an additional $1.3 million we would have to.
And if you look farther down that page on A17, we do have a proposal. It's called Health Insurance Hold Harmless.
Yes.
That's to ensure that during that first half of the year in which employees are not receiving a raise, that we do not increase the employee premiums during that time frame for the board. That's a potential that the board could use one-time monies to address the additional money that needs to flow into the health insurance fund.
Okay.
And that directly as a direct transfer.
So while we'll, in effect, increase compensation by 1% for 12 months or 2% for 6 months, there is a loss of disposable income because of the cost of health insurance.
So what we would do is for that first half year, we would not raise employee premiums.
Understood. Thank you.
And do we know after January 1 what the net impact would be of the 2, if the 2% is put into place, what does that cover of the health? I mean, what's the net percentage roughly?
There are a number of variations that are associated with it. There are some, we are making every effort to ensure that for full-time employees affected by health insurance increases, that they would receive a very slight increase at a minimum and may receive a slightly larger increase depending upon choices that are made on an individual level.
For their plan.
There are a number of different options and different effects that it would have, but we're trying to ensure that at a minimum, no one would take home less.
Okay, and I know you've answered this in another setting. If there were funds to hold harmless, that would not be treated as income.
No, we would make a direct contribution into the
Okay.
health insurance fund and just not bill employees for any rate increases during that time period.
When does
So-
the rate increase start?
October.
October.
Because what we would not want is for them to be impacted by income tax.
Right, right.
On
Yes.
funds we're trying to help them make that.
We wanted to ensure that taxes were not part of this discussion.
Thank you.
And do we believe that the county's employees are in the same boat with our employees?
Yes, ma'am. We've brought this potential solution forward to them, and they're thinking about it during this time period. There's still another month for budget development on their end.
if I were to be so bold as to categorize some of the marquee programs that we advocated in the last couple of years, one would be professional development, two would be the elementary world languages. So I'm still on page A17. It says here, if we were to, and I assume we would, if we were to fully implement the elementary world languages as was described to us in one of our work sessions in the last several months, it would be an additional $1.6 million of funding.
And we actually have, that'll be a part of the instructional opportunity tonight, is that we have
Okay.
rest of
Okay.
Carla here.
Because I realize we can't fund that to 1.6, but I would hate to see us go totally to zero. So if there's some way that we could, maybe put some seed money for one more elementary school to start down that process, I'd be very interested in seeing the proposal for that, how much it would cost.
So for the clarification, I'm sorry I missed your presentation, Pam, but does this budget really have no money in it for the world language, or is it to continue the program as we've had it this past year?
Go ahead.
It would just continue
Okay.
at Kale.
A pretty small implementation, a pretty isolated implementation of the budget.
And not just, and we've wanted to do this for so long,
Yes.
I would, even if it's just some planning money and some starting at the second elementary school, I'd like to see us move it forward a little bit.
I think we'll be able to discuss that more with Rusty.
Yeah.
And my final question then, how much is in our fund balance?
That's approximately available 1.5 million.
1.5.
And how much of that is being allocated in this current?
Oh, good question. There you go. Good question.
Well, that's a very good question.
We're
So.
advocating
go ahead.
approximately 200 and, a combination of things, but it's probably around $420,000.
So we have roughly $1 million undesignated.
If we're, yes, sir.
And one of the things that I think that we really tried to do is that we were living on fund balance as a part of reoccurring for several years. We've really tried to fix that in this year's budget in particular. So what we've said is that we have 3 items, including the insurance, that we would really like to have the board consider as a part of the budgeting process, but it would be contingent upon those funds being available. Because we do have some expenses in this year that the board's aware of that we will have to address. One being the increased UVA staff impact on our insurance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Jackson? I mean, obviously, if something comes up, we can ask at a later time. So we'll move on to Dr. Is it Haas and Collins?
Dr. Haas and Dr. Collins.
Sure, Dr. Collins.
Dr. Mrs.
I'd like
Collins.
to say Professor Collins. So we have 7 slides, and then we're gonna, so what we want to do is, what we want to do is, tonight we're gonna talk a little bit about instructional programs, and then Tuesday night, you notice it's instruction part 2. We've invited some of our principals to come and talk a little bit about how we go through the staffing process, because that's the big ticket item. It's, I think we noted, it's about $2.7 million in growth, and most of that is around instructional staffing. So tonight what we thought we would do is go do a little bit of big picture, then jump into a few of the programs in that big picture that contribute to the growth in funding, both because of growth, but also because of specific student needs. And they would be our special ed program, and then our ESOL program. And then there are a few categories within that that Kevin is going to talk about around special ed. And did you want to add anything to that? All right.
Just jump in.
So Debbie's just going to jump in and fill in the blanks that I leave. We just, again, want to quickly put in front of the board our main goal that we have as a school system. And then in terms of instructional objectives, while in the Department of Instruction and out at the schools, we emphasize all 5 objectives. The 3 that I highlighted are the ones that we're going to target and talk a little bit about. In terms of the overall budget, we just want to reaffirm that instruction is the lion's share of our operational budget. It takes up 3/4 of it, and all other functions represent about 24% out of the total budget of 166 million, close to 167. Did you want to add anything to that, Jim? And then in terms of within that instructional budget, we want to emphasize that close to 92% of that is school-based. So the dollars go out into the schools and are directly impacting students through the services that we provide and the personnel that provide them, while about 8% of it, a very small proportion, goes into the departments. To break it out further, I just wanted to, I realize that these are on pages C8 through 25, where you can look at the school-based instructional programs and see the listing of them, and it starts with the largest and works its way to the smallest. But I think it's always good to have a visual representation to see how things break out in terms of instruction, with, again, the largest piece of that is in regular education, and then a slightly, a smaller piece by proportion around special education. And Kevin's going to talk a little bit tonight about what goes into making that up. And then the next pieces get smaller and smaller, and then working your way onto the next pie, which is really a piece of the pie from the first page. So they get rather small around RTI, alternative education, representing small pieces of the pie.
Matt, I would add in this is that part of this is our commitment to excellence. There are programs in here that go above state standards. We all know that. Elementary art, music, and PE are above standards, but these are what we feel like are our pieces around excellence.
I will note that we did have mentioned at the last board meetings around athletics. I did talk, Jackson and I have talked to the athletic directors. We've asked them to update the table that we gave to the board last year, so we will be presenting that to you. They just need a couple of days to turn that around. So we'll get that information.
Appreciate that.
You're welcome. Okay, so we want to go ahead and jump into instructional expenses. Tonight, we wanted to highlight some very specific school-based programs because, as I mentioned earlier, overall the growth represents about 2.7 million, and within that you've got some growth in terms of special education students, both, well, not really in terms of larger numbers of special education students, but in the growth of their needs. And Kevin's going to talk a little bit about that. He's also going to address special ed preschool, RTI, and then we have Dr. Carlock here tonight to talk a little bit about the ESOL program, where that is actually a growth in number of students and a growth in what their needs are.
Okay. What I wanted to do was give you some background into some of the acronyms I use a little later, but also highlight some of the changes in the division that we've used to meet those objectives for all students. That includes students with disabilities. I'll be referring to preschool programs, that are really our early childhood special education programs that are required by law in order to provide opportunities for preschool-age children. There's something referred to as the VAP, or VAP Classroom or Services. That's the Virginia Alternate Assessment Program. And you'll see for most of these, that's a common thread. This is the assessment program for 1% of our student population with the most significant disabling conditions, typically intellectual disabilities. But this VAP refers to elementary level classrooms and programs that are designed for these children that require specialized instruction. Something new this year is referred to as home-based services. These are for children with autism in our regular education environment that require extensive services and supports. I will refer to functional skills classrooms. Those are at the middle school level. Same population, children with intellectual disabilities, includes some children with autism. Then we move to community-based instruction at the high school level. and finish off the experience at the post-high program for students aged 18 to 22. Again, that are in the VAP program all the way through their career. This is
Kevin,
yeah.
can you, just for clarification, on the preschool program, when you talk about programs blending, that's not staff for Bright Stars or Title I in this budget?
That's correct. My special education budget is only for, or addresses, staff that serve students with disabilities. Even though I'm blending, it's a program, we work collaboratively, but I'm only reflecting my staffing in that proposal.
I'm curious why there's a post-high school component.
It is a design to increase outcomes for students with disabilities. What we found by having students repeat grades, it's required that students be offered a free and appropriate education through age 21.
Okay.
That keeping them at the high school for an additional 3 to 4 years wasn't getting much traction on the outcomes. So the post-high program is a school board supported initiative a number of years ago, where there's a modified building behind Burley Middle School that is designed to really focus on vocational skills, social skills, and living skills, independent living skills for that population of students. Very successful.
Every year, they have a holiday open house there, and then they have a graduation in May or June, and it's really worth your time to visit during that time, to just get a feel for the students they work with and what a difference that program makes in their lives.
But are we required legally to do a post-high school program?
That's a program design.
Okay.
We're required to provide services, not in that context.
Okay.
That is a local decision. So what I wanted to show was both, and this is the first, is yes, the numbers are increasing for students with disabilities. My request for additional staffing is not just based on demographic change, it is also the number is increasing. So I have the numbers over the last, well, this year and the previous 3, just to get a sense it's creeping up there. And then I referenced those specialized programs. You could see those too are increasing as my career has moved through the years. To address, as you'll see in a moment, the changing demographics of students with disabilities in Albemarle County schools. It is to both meet our objectives here locally, but also defined federally and at the state level, which is providing an appropriate education to increase outcomes and achievement.
Kevin, if I could clarify, we oftentimes say to the board that the demographic that's increasing at the fastest pace inside the continuum of special education would be those programs like post-high, home-based, VAP, that pick up kids with much more significant disabilities.
That is very correct. Again, as noted on the number of programs that are increasing, based on a number of outside factors, including evidence-based practices, outcomes, and research. But the next slide, next 2 slides, start to hit, I'm sorry.
Going back to the previous slide, the numbers, so in 14-15 you have that box. What are the numbers?
Yes, the number of classrooms, which could be loosely interpreted as the base standard of 1 teacher and 2 teaching assistants.
Okay.
So we see 8 pre-K classes. That is 8 teachers, 16 teaching assistants.
9
Not, yes.
Eight
And, oh,
now.
that's right, down at 14, 15.
Yeah.
That's right, so each individual number is a classroom of children. Unfortunately, it doesn't reflect like how at capacity we are in those classes. Like 1 year, it's, we're pretty close.
And I believe that the 8 to 9 represents the class that you added in the Western feeder pattern in response to parents that had concern about their children being bused.
It
Because we
does.
didn't have space there.
It does. It reflects the Brownsville, the classroom at Brownsville. And
So you have home base there added, and yet it's not there in the previous years.
That's correct. That is a new.
Three essential classrooms, so 3 houses, homes are being served.
Three classes at 3 different locations in the division have specialized services for children with autism that attend regular ed classes.
So when you say home base, explain that term.
Home base, yes. So the home base, we call it home base, and I love it to catch. And no knock against baseball. It's more of the summer tag game, where home base is where you'd go to rest and recoup when you're playing tag. So we've called it home base services versus necessarily a classroom where children with autism stay. So they're out in the regular classroom, but we know children with autism sometimes are overstimulated, sensory overload. And instead of any type of disciplinary action, they have an advocate, a teacher, and support to go to, get them back on track, and it's working exceptionally well.
So that's kind of new for this year then?
It is
So we have
new this
3
year, yes.
Okay.
And that represents also some of the work that Kevin's doing to try to have our children who are on the spectrum or who have autism to be able to stay inside our schools rather than being placed outside.
That is correct.
So this actually is, in some ways, a cost containment measure.
It is very much a cost containment measure, and also an ethical and moral, I think, obligation and direction to keep children in their neighborhood schools. I mean, that is the effort here. It's, on many fronts, it's working extremely well. Very many more happy parents.
And when you have that 3 post-high number, does that mean we have 3 staff members there? at
That's
the
exactly,
post-high house?
that is exactly right, Steve. It's 3 teachers with 2 teaching assistants tagged to them. They're all in one location, but it's technically 3 classes in that one location. I want to talk about one of the questions that comes up is, so how do you do staffing? I'm going to refer to, and maybe you've heard, points. Now, with sensitivity, they're all children, but points are used, or at least designed at the state level through regulations, that our programs must have a base average of 20 points per 1 FTE of a special education teacher. So we allocate points based on the special education services time per week. There are children that we consider 1-point students. They receive between 1 and 49% of their special ed services per week. 2.5 point students, they receive between 50 and 100% of their special ed services during the week. And then there's a special group of children, a special group of children that receive 3.3 points. And they're specifically children with autism or multiple disabilities that again receive between 50 and 100% of their services. The state recognizes they need a bit more support in that calculation. Teaching assistants are allocated in my specialized programs, 2 per class, as noted earlier. But there also have to be staff based on the IEP. So a child with significant, let's say, medical issues or require behavioral supports. The teaching assistants written in the IEP, we as a division are obligated to staff that child and meet the obligations of the individualized education program. And again, these are accepted based on criteria that are in the Virginia regulations. So that's sort of the cold numbers. But they're used to give a sense of how the demographics are changing. And I've chosen, because there's some variability between years, but it's a nice look back, again, 3 years, between the population then and now. And very quickly, the 1-point children, the children that are served between 1 and 49% of their week in special education, they haven't changed much. Where we're seeing the biggest bump are the children that are more significantly impaired. And you can see that's the increase. It's not the relatively low resource or.
So are those better, are those new students or are better ways of observing and identifying those students? Or a combination?
It really is a combination of both. Our December 1st count, we're very active in the community with our child find process, our eligibility process. We're much more accurate. in our diagnosis and classification of children that require specialized services, but we also have a number. As you're seeing, it's reflective of your general population. More families are moving in. They have children with disabilities.
And the other thing that,
Okay,
I'm sorry.
and one reason the 799, the bottom number hasn't changed, I think, is that we're providing better educational services for kids in that category, so they never quite get around to being recognized as needing special education. So that number would be going up too if it weren't for that factor.
That number is for children that require special education services, so there are no non-eligible.
Right, what I'm saying is that kids before who might have had greater educational weaknesses would have then gotten identified as special ed.
Yes.
But because we're doing a better job of catching those problems early,
Yes.
then they don't require the service.
I do agree with that, yes, that our response to intervention efforts have decreased the number of children that require just some supports. That's correct. Yeah. So this is the demographic bump. It also includes the frequency number. Any questions on this? Because I'm going to jump into the comprehensive
I
service.
do have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so when we're talking Special Education Comprehensive Services Act, how much money is Albemarle County funding this with, and how much money is coming from the federal government towards these services?
For just my special ed program?
Yes.
I have to run my exact numbers, but the last look, it was around 12%.
So the federal government is paying 12% and Albemarle County is paying the remainder?
No, there's some state, to be accurate, I could get the breakdown based on our most recent
I say that
figures.
because the public needs to understand, how the funding of these services are provided, and how we really have nothing, but we cannot do anything to change this. This is not something that we can take any money from, because we are required to pay for these services. And I think it's important that the public understands what a large part of our budget this takes, that is coming out of the county coffers. And really should be coming from federal coffers. But it's another one of those instances where higher level government is passing on costs to local counties. So it would be nice to have that breakout, just so the public is aware of the costs involved here.
Well, and I think, Mr. Colazar, you usually remind the board that under IDEA, that there's a very different expectation about the federal government share than we actually get, and it's...
Originally it was passed, the Fed said they would fund 40%, and it's about 12, they've never come close.
Right.
I was thinking it was 14 or 16, I didn't realize it was.
I thought it was 14, and I think it was 14, but I would like to have that breakout, and I just think it's very important that the public understands the importance of funding this. That everybody deserves to have a public education, and we need to fund children for what their individualized programs require.
And that bottom line number is 14 million.
And when you go out, and Kevin makes the point so clearly that you can talk about points and you can talk about programs that help us to try to get at cost containment around things that if we can do it better inside our schools, that's really good for the families and it's good for us as a school division. But when you go out and you walk into a classroom, and I was in one recently, one of the elementary schools, and saw a child who, at age 5, had been equipped with assistive devices that was allowing this child really for the first time ever to be able to communicate with family, with friends at school, to be able to really focus on learning. Kevin, I don't know if you might describe that. It's not an inexpensive piece of what we do, but boy, does it make a difference in the life of a child and of a family.
Well, that case, and there's multiple cases.
All
Those
over.
specialized programs that are now showing up at the elementary level specifically, kids are communicating where before there was little to no functional communication. And that begins the whole process of accessing education.
And that might be a child that can only communicate with the blink of an eye. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely correct, yes.
We're adding about $1 million and 10 FTEs to this program. Is that correct, over where we were budgeted this year? Is that a result of,
You-
I'm not aware of it.
I think it's 3 point.
We're 3.5 FTEs.
3.5 and an occupational therapist.
We're looking at page C11.
Yeah, I
It
see.
shows going from 252.79 to 262.68.
Some of that may be TAs.
Okay, okay.
total FTEs?
Yes.
Teachers, TAs,
Yes.
and we're adding about $1 million. Budget to budget.
Yeah.
That includes salary increases and benefit increases, health insurance.
But it also includes 10 new staff members.
No, I imagine that has to do with the growth that you
It's-
discussed
It's
here.
because of the trading of teachers and TAs. We have a process by which we will budget 3.5 FTE teachers for special education. But Mr. Kirst, it's the opportunity of trading in one of those teachers for 3 TAs if he needs them. So in terms of FTE, there's some variability between the numbers depending upon the choices made for teachers or teaching assistant staff. But we do have a formula for trading those in. So if you're looking at FTE, those FTE numbers used in the budget book are FTE in terms of bodies in the classroom
So if I'm
over a
looking at
period of time.
24.5, I would
Okay.
divide it by 3, and that would be the number of FTEs, teacher FTEs.
Teacher FTEs.
Okay, you know, I think it's confusing because when we say FTEs, we have a very different definition, but it's, the column is FTE and it's not FTEs, it's total bodies.
It is FTE, a full-time equivalent.
Okay, so when it says here that we are budgeting for 56.77 TAs, right? That means we're really budgeting for 150 because they're.
We have a process by which we allow schools and
Yeah, I
programs.
understand the process. What I'm saying is, you've got a column labeled FTEs that is really total employees and not FTEs.
Well, they can
And
be
so-
one and the same.
They are FTEs, but they're not all
But
FTE
the
teachers.
total, the total is not FTEs, because.
It is FTEs.
Okay.
Let us,
Okay.
One body can be one FTE if they work,
if it's a teacher.
if they work 2,080 hours a year, it's the equivalent of a full-time person.
No, when we say FTE in our staffing charts means a teacher or 3 TAs.
But a TA can be one FTE if they work a full-time.
No, it's.
The only place in which the FTE operates in the way in which you're describing is in that staffing chart that's in the supporting documentation.
Right.
Everywhere else in this budget document, an FTE refers to a full-time equivalent, a person that works what's considered to be full-time for that job description. For a teacher, it may be 7.25 hours a day for 200 days a year. For a TA, it may be 182 days a year at 7.25 hours or 8 hours, depending upon what the job description is. So it's relative, the FTE is relative to the job description of the position that's being filled.
Let us take that as a question
Okay.
and make sure we get it clarified in a follow-up document. Can we do that?
So
Okay.
let me distill it down to my observation.
I'm
see-
confusing it with too much information.
That's all right. I see an increase, what appears to be an increase in staff. And is that a result of an increase in enrollment?
Can I have a follow-on question? Because I think the answer still leads to where Mr. Strucko is going. Mr. Kirst, you have roughly 5 FTE in the multi-school service. Can you talk a little bit about that? in regards, because that's half the FTE
The
increase.
increase, yeah.
It's the home base.
3.5 of those FTE are due to growth.
And that
Well,
would be
4.5,
the home-
sorry,
would be
because that
home
includes
base,
the
right?
occupational therapist.
That would be the home-based program?
I'm referring to page C10, in the last section. right
Yeah.
there.
So one of the things that happens is multi-school service is typically when you have people that are moving across more than one
That's right.
school
Like my
location.
related service providers.
Okay. So that could be an OT, a PT, any of the staff that,
Correct.
school psychologists, not in this category, but in other places.
Yeah, I read the staffing standards section in here, which I think explains what you're looking for. You have a special education teacher, and you have a point system here, 20 points per full-time teacher. And then you have another standard here that says special education teachers. It's full-time teacher per class, a maximum of 8 students with disabilities. I assume these are standards that we have to maintain.
Right.
And because we've seen an increase in either points or students, their corresponding reaction has been the staffing increase.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the occupational therapist is based on the number of children with severe disabilities, and they've maxed out their case limits.
For a maximum 1,900 minutes
Yes.
per week.
Well, you could technically have the same amount of students, but your costs go up because of the need of the staffing for the type of students you're serving. So just the staff increase alone, obviously if there's growth, would probably occur, but even if growth doesn't occur, you can still see an increase in special education costs.
Yes.
Does,
Could I ask a question about the, we have both an increase in the numbers and an increase in the severity. Is that across the age spectrum, or is it concentrated at kids entering school, A, and then B, if it's concentrated at, are any of the point systems, I'm sorry, I haven't read it that carefully yet, tied to the age of the students? I mean, are the ratios or the points awarded similarly if they're in pre-K or post-high school? You know what I'm asking.
Yes, so the points refer to any age child,
Okay.
and they're not weighted, for any particular group or disability outside of what was shared already.
Okay.
We are noticing a bubble of kids. I wouldn't say significant, like, oh, we're gonna expect savings in 3 years when kids age out. But there is a bubble that's tracking through the high school, right now at the high school level, but consistent trends. We're catching them earlier. We have a very active preschool evaluation team right upstairs in 323 that does just about half of all the special education evaluations in the whole division, 3 individuals upstairs. So we're catching the children earlier that need our support. So that's sort of, and the indication is a steady stream with that kind of bubble at the high school right now that we're trying to control for.
does our split feeder pattern have any bearing on these costs? Because I can imagine some of them, being highly specialized.
Yeah,
problem
we
students.
try and cluster, so those different programs, we try and represent in each feeder pattern, but if we do max out or a program isn't available, we transport across feeder patterns across the division to meet needs.
Is that fairly significant, or is it?
Yeah, as the number grows of opportunities and programs, we decrease the travel time and having to remove children from their neighborhood schools. But it is significant based on, you could see, 5 classes or 3 home-based programs, for example. That's only 3 elementary schools, so,
Okay.
yeah.
And Kevin, before you go into the
Yep.
comprehensive services, I know that because we are involved with PrEP, and I know that that's a cost savings for us. Do you have a sense of how much savings?
I could get it.
I think down the road, it could be, you know, it's something that we talk about each year, that being a part of that regional program is a value to us.
It is, versus Comprehensive Services Act, or
Just in general?
in general. Yeah, we could get
I think we're in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So if we weren't involved in prep, our costs would go up.
Our
That's
costs
what I
would
need to
increase.
get.
And the issue is whether or not we can obtain those services at the levels that we need them without having to employ full-time staff, because we're using part of people that are full-time. Could we attract
Right.
somebody who's full-time, I mean, with a part-time job?
We need a part-time PT, but we have to hire a full-time PT because we otherwise get a part-time PT.
But I could get, I mean, we could.
That's just supplemental. I think it's something that we've, over the last couple of budget cycles, we've often said that is a savings for us, but we've never gone forward and said, here's what we're saving.
And it's also savings on the next few slides with Comprehensive Services Act. It is another avenue to support children that are the most significantly disabled and challenging to serve. Okay. The Comprehensive Services Act. The Comprehensive Services Act is just that. It is a law that has attached to it funding to help provide services to children, and in our case, under the school division's case, children who are eligible for special education services. These children have a right to a free and appropriate public education, and really the children with IEPs have worked through the public school system and all the supports that we could offer, and have proved that their needs are beyond our capacity to serve appropriately. I could go into more depth about that, but for the essence of time, their placement has resulted in one of two options. The context is referred to as congregate care, or as we know, residential programs. Presently, there are 6 children that are placed by the public school system in residential programs, just to get a sense of the context and costs and numbers. And also, although this is the whole issue with county government, is Department of Social Services and Region 10 are responsible for the other 6 cases that make up a total of 12. Those other 6 cases also have are children with disabilities and have IEPs, but it all is associated to the special ed costs that we're responsible for. The other option through CSA are private day placements. And presently, and this represents the highest cost for CSA increase across the state, mirrored right here in Albemarle County. Presently, there are 45 cases of children with special needs in private day placements in our area, and really in Virginia. There's a few stragglers in other localities that we're responsible for. I want to point out, unlike IDEA, this is a state-run operation, and locally, for those children placed in residential or congregate care or private day placements, locally we pay 44.74% of the cost. That is the match rate. It is a standard match rate for students in special education. 55.2%, 26% is picked up by the state. There's a recognition that these children require even more than our most challenged children in our public schools. I put in some numbers here just to get a sense of the cost. Congregate care, there is a span, a range between around more than 56,000 a year to 256,000 per year per student, but it typically falls a little over 200,000 a year for a residential placement. Medicaid is used regularly. In 100% of the cases, we access Medicaid whenever possible to minimize the cost to the locality and the state. Those base costs are for education and room and board only. Does not include special therapies. That's typically in addition, like speech, occupational therapy, counseling. And then your private day placements range from a little over $34,000 a year to right around the top, about $65,000 per year. Again, special therapies are not included in that base rate.
And what kind of students would be served in the private day placement?
Those are, and this is typical, because there's a lot, that 47, I think it was a lot of variance, but generally speaking, we're talking about children with autism that have displayed such significant behaviors, typically aggressive behaviors, that our staff and our structure and capacity could not address in order to provide them an appropriate education. And there's been issues of safety at the schools as well. There is also another population in that group of children with emotional disabilities and health impairments, but the common thread is behaviors are so extreme that the public schools cannot address, have not been successful in addressing them, and have sought services outside of the public school building, facilitated by your special education coordinators.
What's the trend line on students in this category?
Well, clearly it's going up. I don't have a graphical display for you. I could work it to get you one, but it is increasing and mirrors the state. Yes, pointing north.
I mean, and is there some way we can find to?
I mean, just this year alone, compared to last, we're up 8 students at the same time last year. So it's growing. And again, those are students that I've personally been involved with this year, and trying to provide as many supports in the school as possible. Having outside folks come in and just, having to go.
I know, we went and built Ivy Creek to reduce this kind of cost for one group.
That is
And
true.
Is that something that maybe we need to look at, something similar?
It does support and minimize the cost.
Yeah.
Children with emotional disabilities, I think we're just about maxed out at the Ivy Creek facility. We have 29 slots there,
Yeah.
and we do utilize that before we go to private day for those children that are eligible for the service. So it is actively being used as part of the whole process to minimize costs.
Does most of the variability in the congregate care or residential cost, is that related to the needs of the students or the location of the placement or mystery?
Yes, so the cost is related to the type of program. The low-end program is a wilderness type program. Great deal, it's down in Dillwyn, Virginia, and very successful for a specific type of student with disabilities. Whereas the larger end, even the mid-range one, is an intensive psychiatric-based, therapeutic, almost hospital-like facility. It's a locked facility. So it's the type, it's the context of service that drives the cost.
But all of these are located in Virginia?
Yes, no, with the exception of one student, all are in Virginia. One is out of state. That we've actually, several of you.
So what's the cost burden on Albemarle taxpayers for each of these broken out? Is that in the budget book, or is that something that you need to come back with us? And can we see like maybe a 5-year trend of that?
Of the breakout, the local cost at 44%
Yeah.
match rate, I could do that for you.
Yeah, please, thank you.
Sure.
I think I actually understand Steve's question. So were you suggesting that either
I mean,
a facility like Ivy Creek?
Right, I mean, that's the question, is that at some point would it behoove us to build another facility similar to Ivy Creek, and would the cost savings justify the capital investment?
It would be worth study. But I wouldn't say flat out, totally endorse. I think it would be the right.
Okay.
And when you say 29 slots, that's Albemarle slots?
That is correct. Albemarle County students have access to 29 seats at Ivy Creek School.
It also would be my understanding that there are students that are in this program that could have been in Ivy Creek and needed to move to a more restrictive environment.
Absolutely. There are children that's typically how it works. That it is we call the least restrictive environment process, where it's from public school to private we go public day when appropriate, to private day, to congregate care. So there are children with a history that have tried all those contexts out before they've landed.
And Kevin, one thing we had talked about earlier is that some students go for a school year, and then some are there for a calendar year. Is that the case with the data that you have, or is that not?
It's mixed. Typically, your congregate or residential care is a 365-day program, where your private day runs the same calendar as public schools, with some services in the summer when a child is eligible.
I would imagine it's probably, you have some significant challenges forecasting this, because there's a lot of variables in there, and you don't know whether a family might move in the area, and we've got to pick up those costs. I mean, when those costs become greater than what we forecast, how are we funding it?
That's where we're all working with the local government side and brainstorming, and
Fund
that's
balance.
where we're at. Yeah.
Has been used.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, specifically in years past, this particular item was why the 2% fund balance was maintained, or a big part of the concern, as a likely expense where you would need that fund balance, you would need that to.
Yes, and we also had a fund balance on the CSA side. We're managing it, and it's both number of kids and costs are going up. Those private placements, they have all their increases as well.
And we have had kids who the cost has exceeded the range that you have here.
Yeah, that's right, in the past.
Yes.
But this pretty much reflects billing as of December.
And this would be, Dean, I don't know if you're ready to answer this question, but I know that there was talk about CSA and how it could potentially change where it's at in the funding formula. Is that ongoing? Is that something that is going to come up in discussion for this budget cycle?
Staff needs to do some additional work on that. As I've told the board before, I put on the table some thoughts about trying to reduce the risk, the exposure of the school board to the vagaries of this funding amount. The county recognizes that they have greater capacity for those vagaries than does the school board, but they also obviously have some concerns about assuming responsibility for that financial commitment. So we will try to wrap up those conversations in time for this year's budget process if we can, and get a conclusion to bring to the board for consideration.
And Kevin, I believe you have found that it is more typical for CSA to sit on the government side than on the school division side. We're not the only school division in the state that has some shared CSA. But I think you did research a couple of years ago and found that there was a trend towards it being a local government service.
That's correct. That was my understanding of the analysis.
I actually have one more question, because I don't see it in here either, but I know that we are also required to pay some of the medical services, such as nurses' aides, for a number of special education students. Isn't that correct?
Yes, if the IEP requires it.
Where is that located in the cost here? Is it here under school-based instruction, or where does that fall in the budget?
It fall under, at least presently, the way I'm funding programs. I do not have a nurse on staff that is required by any IEP. I have a trained teaching assistant that has the qualifications to do basic health checks. So it is inside the FTEs for teaching assistants.
It's
part of the
So
staff.
nurses' aides that we support under IEPs are counted as teaching assistants.
At least the only medically trained person I have is a teaching assistant with some background enough to support the child as per the IEP. So I don't have any specific nurses that I'm employing through special ed that are required. And any in-kind services, dispensing of medication, we've been utilizing your nurses.
School nurses.
School nurses.
School nurses.
Yes, but no dedicated nurses are required. Again, could it happen, someone moved into the division? Yes, but at this time, it is not part of it.
Because I know one year we had several cases like that. So it's really year dependent.
It is.
You really don't know what you're going to come up with on a given year.
That is correct.
It's IEP dependent.
IEP dependent and yes, migration.
Very good. Any other questions for Kevin? I think now would be a good time for us to take a break and we'll pick up with,
Okay, so Kevin covered everything.
Carl?
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about ESOL and growth. So, as most of you already know, we have experienced significant growth within the ESOL population.
Can I just stop? One of the things that I think may help the board as well as people that could be listening, see if you can reference the pages in the budget book, Rusty, that are the ESOL pages. That might be helpful.
So this is on C18.
Thank you.
And I'll talk a little bit about the growth that we're experiencing and the needs associated with that growth, and then the impact on the budget request for this year. In addition, I'll talk about interpretation and translation as one of the associated needs with the rise in this population in our schools. As you can see from this graph, we've experienced significant growth over the last 3 years. On average, in the last 2 years, we've received about 75 additional ESOL students. This is certainly a significant growth rate increase over the last really 7 years, something that we haven't seen since then. It's not unprecedented though. These are similar growth rates to what we saw in the early 2000s and in the 1990s. ESOL population does tend to be correlated to economic development. With economic development comes more international families moving into our community, and we are seeing that at this point. What is important about this particular growth trend that we're seeing right now is that it's primarily happening in the secondary schools. That's important because we staff, and I'll talk a little bit about how we staff in a moment, but we do staff our secondary schools higher relative to how we staff our elementary schools for ESOL students. And that's because there's a larger gap between a student's language and the complexity of the curriculum that they're seeing. So a student that comes in speaking very little English, it's a lot more difficult for them to access a U.S. history course, for example, than a kindergartner coming in at the same level of English language proficiency. So let's say level 1, for example. And so that's important because the growth is happening, but it's also happening at that secondary level that has a larger impact on staffing as a result. Just to illustrate this, one example, 2.5 years ago in our newcomer program at the high school level, we had 5 students that qualified as newcomers in the county. This year, we had 36, and there were 23 just at Albemarle High School. And that was as of September 30th, and we've received additional students since then. It's important to think about how that impacts staffing, not just within our ESOL classes, what we're seeing at Albemarle High School and Monticello High School, which have been impacted by this most. It's also impacting elective courses, enrollment in those courses, Algebra 1, some of the language arts courses that are the first language arts courses that students take in their program of studies in high school. And so that's how we've begun to mitigate this impact, is that we've used some emergency staffing this year from the Department of Instruction in order to reduce some of those class sizes and be able to provide additional sections of courses that are required for students to graduate. So I'll pause there to see, are there any questions about this slide before I move on? And I'll address some of the deeper issues around the impact of the growth later, but I want to make sure everyone understands this.
Because of UVA, we tend to have, to a certain extent, our ESOL population tends to be bifurcated. In other words, if you have a child or a professor coming to UVA, they've got a fairly strong academic background, And then we have refugees coming with very little schooling. This growth that you're talking about, can you characterize it by type of student?
We are seeing growth in both of those populations. We are seeing larger growth in the latter of the two. So the refugee and students coming oftentimes with interrupted schooling. And so that's another aspect of it. Those students tend to progress more slowly through the program, so they require more years of services. What we see is that the children that come with high levels of education in their native language, they may start at the same place, but they advance much more quickly than students that have interrupted schooling backgrounds. So just to discuss a little bit about how staffing occurs, we use the WIDA assessment that is from the state of Virginia, and we are part of a consortium. So there are 32 states in the nation that use this assessment of English language proficiency. And when a student enters our school division, we give them this language assessment, and it scores them anywhere between a level 1 and a level 5. A level 1 student is someone who speaks very little or no English whatsoever. A level 5 student, on the other hand, is someone who's nearly fluent. And in order to graduate from the ESOL program, be considered fluent in English, they have to score a level 5 on their literacy component and their oral language component. So if you just score a level 5 on speaking and listening, but you're still struggling with reading and writing, then you can't graduate. So we have to support students across the 4 domains of language in order for them to exit the program as being considered fluent. In addition to that, we monitor students for 2 years, and this is based on the federal guidelines. So that's where we get the 6-1 and 6-2. These are students who have passed the test, graduated from the program, but we still monitor them for 2 additional years before completely exiting them from additional services.
And that was a new federal requirement just in the last few years to add that as a monitoring.
2007, I believe, is when they began that. And you can see so this was from earlier this month in January, these numbers. And you can see that the largest group within this distribution are students at that level 1. I can tell you that this was not the case 2 years ago. So if we were to look at this same distribution from 2 years ago, level 3, level 4s would have been higher than that level 1. So this is also indicating that we have more students coming in at that lower level of English language proficiency than we've had in the previous few years, which is part of why we're asking for additional support, because these are students who speak very little English, often coming into the middle and high school levels. Any questions about this piece?
Rusty, I wonder if you might speak about the staffing of the different levels.
So we use a ratio, and it starts at 1 to 15, so 1 teacher for 15 children at level 1, and goes all the way up. So level 5, 6-1s and 6-2s are staffed at 1 to 80. And this is an internal formula that we use, but it is we benchmark that with other school divisions. And just to let you know how we compare to how we do staffing here relative to the rest of the state, about 2.5 years ago, again, when we use our benchmark, we were at about 1 teacher, 1 ESOL teacher for every 32 students, ESOL students in the division. Right now, we're at about 1 to 35. Fairfax and most of the other affluent divisions in Northern Virginia staff at around 132 to 133, so we are not far from them. We were staffed at about the same as Fairfax about 2.5 years ago. Now we've gone above them. We're now about the same as the city. So the city of Charlottesville is about the same as us as far as how we staff our students. One important piece here, because if you look at the standards of quality from the state of Virginia, it is 17 teachers for every 1,000 students. So that's about a 1 to 58 ratio. There are not, I shouldn't say that. There are quite a few less affluent divisions in this state that staff at that level. They do not tend to be the types of divisions that we compare ourselves to in looking at Charlottesville City and Northern Virginia, for example. Does that help a little bit?
So when you say we're staffing 1 to 80 from 5 to 6, 1 to 6-2, are we doing just support type services? This isn't.
So that translates into about 20 minutes a week So when we talk about monitoring, we look at our ESOL teachers are looking at their all of their grades. They are talking to the students every once in a while, similar to what a guidance counselor might do. There's also great variation. So occasionally we will have one of those students who struggles, and we run a report, and this is also based on federal guidelines. We run a report twice a year at the division level of all of those students, and we look at several things. We look at attendance, we look at SOL scores, and we look at grades. And most of our students are doing exceptionally well, and that's one of the pieces that I really enjoy doing, is because we get to see the students who have graduated from our program, how are they doing in their classes. The vast majority of our students, once they graduate our ESOL program, are doing exceptionally well. Occasionally we have students who continue to struggle, and then we'll touch base with the teachers of those students to find out, is this a language issue? Was this student exited based on this test before they should have been? Or are these other things that are impacting their learning? If we determine that it is a language-based issue, that perhaps the test was not accurate, that allowed us to exit them, then we will bring them back into services. I'll tell you that happens with about maybe 2 students each year where we determine that it's language-based and they were prematurely exited from the program.
I would also note that one of the reasons why we see staffing is needing to be more in line with what you would see in a Northern Virginia community is because the number of languages that we have compared to small rural areas is much more diverse. That means that teachers have to have a grasp of a greater level of skill set across multiple different languages that they're having to work with in some of our schools, and then also just the resources that you need to be able to help kids make that transition from native language to English. And I know that you have to look at things like dictionaries and other kinds of resources. So that is something that makes us more like the Northern Virginia counties that have greater diversity of languages, whereas you might go to some areas in the state and find that that diversity is much less in terms of the languages that kids speak in an area.
That's certainly the case, and what we see is in many of our schools where we have children from a variety of cultures, there are many aspects of their culture that can be misunderstood, or when trying to understand what is impacting their learning from a cultural standpoint, having teachers who are familiar with working with this group of students is really valuable. And we're able to bring those kinds of teachers in as a result of the kind of staffing support that we have.
Are you in question and answer phase now, or?
With this piece, I want to address the interpretation and translation piece as well, but this, I can answer questions about the ESOL growth piece right now.
Well, I guess this relates to the growth. What does you alluded to how the instruction operates. It's essentially one-on-one for short periods of time, or because there's so many languages?
So it varies significantly based on the student's English language proficiency. So the highest impact on staffing is on our newcomers and from our newcomers. So students that are coming in with very little English. At the high school level, I'll use as an example, about half of their day is in classes with other ESOL students and with a specialized ESOL teacher that works with them to develop academic language. We connect that academic language support. They're not learning playground speech, they're learning the language of science, for example, so that as soon as possible, as soon as they're ready, we can transition them into graduation required courses. The second half of their day is going to be in electives, so things like art, music, PE, the types of courses that they need to take for graduation that are not highly intensive as far as language goes, and that supports their social relationship building with their native English speaking peers. So they have half the day where they're very much focused on learning English, and then half the day where they're earning graduation requirements, but they're socializing with their English speaking peers and they're applying some of the skills that they learned in that language class. Now, as soon as possible, the second year, many of our students at that point are already only taking one ESOL class or one double blocked class. So they go from half of their day to just an hour and a half a day receiving specialized ESOL instruction. And by the time they get to level 3, 4, and 5, many of our students are in mainstream classes One thing that we've done to try to impact efficiency, because our ratios are going up as far as the number of students to each teacher, is we're having our teachers work with a lot of classroom teachers around strategies that they can adopt that are effective for these students, so that they can be in a class with a mainstream teacher without ESOL support, but that mainstream teacher has at least some level of training on how to support them in that class.
So a typical ESOL teacher might have 7 or 8 students with different languages, different native languages, and be able to deal with all of them.
Yes. And additionally, one thing that makes ESOL extremely challenging is students don't just arrive at the beginning of the year and then stay throughout the year. So you might have a cohort of 10 students that you've been working with for an extended period of time. You have everybody exactly where you want them to be, and then you get a group of 3 new students come in that speak no English, and then you really have to think about how to differentiate your instruction for that new group of students, and really be creative about how we're moving students out of a schedule into a different schedule as their language progresses. So there any other questions about the ESOL growth piece before I move on to interpretation and translation?
So Rusty, this might be a dumb question, but when you say, like at Albemarle High School this year, they had 23 newcomers, what you're saying is newcomers to English, not newcomers, they just showed up.
Newcomer, so we define a newcomer as a student that's arrived within the last year who, when they arrived, spoke little or no English, so we're at level 1.
Right, so it's not about just being new, it's new to English.
New to English and new to the country.
Okay.
Yeah.
And in our budget notebook, it says we have students from 60 countries, born in 60 different countries, and speaking around 80 different languages.
Yes, that's accurate. Well, thank you all. The second piece to this that's associated with is a budget item for interpretation and translation. And the number of students with parents who are non-native English speakers is nearly twice as large as our ESOL population. And the reason for that is each year we graduate about 150 students from our ESOL program. They become fluent in English. Many of these children, however, their parents are not fluent in English. And so even though their children can speak English, in order to have effective communication with their parents, they still require multilingual services. Federal regulations require that schools provide an interpretation and translation system with trained personnel for information that is important to a child's education. Around 2 years ago, the Special Education ESOL department collaborated to create a division-wide system that met these guidelines from the Office of Civil Rights. Prior to that, there was no division-wide system. What we saw was a lot of variation across our schools as far as access to multilingual services. So the Special Education Department put forward money in order to fund this initiative internally as a pilot. And there were 2 reasons for that. One is we wanted to show the viability of a pilot to see if we could create a system that was useful to all the stakeholders, so teachers, principals, most importantly the families and the students themselves. And we also wanted to define and really determine where real demand was. This was the first time that we were trying to create a division-wide system that met the OCR requirements, and so we didn't exactly know how much that was going to cost. And so we wanted that to be based on real demand. So we made an estimate based on the number of non-native English-speaking students at each school. We pushed out funds to those schools, and then we saw at the end of the year, we tracked how much each school had used. And we also gave them guidelines on these are the kinds of things that should be interpreted or translated. These are the kinds of things that the requirements do not cover. So a PTO newsletter, for example, is not something that the OCR would say needs to be translated. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you don't necessarily have to do it. A parent-teacher conference, because it's important to students' education, is something that needs to have an interpreter if you're going to have one of those conferences with a parent. At the end of the year, schools spent about $24,000 out of this fund. And this is not including the multilingual services that were provided by school staff during the instructional day, during their contract hours. So we have a lot of teachers who get pulled to do interpretation work sometimes. We have TAs who are bilingual who do this kind of work. We have office staff sometimes who are bilingual and do this kind of work. So this was above and beyond that kind of day-to-day contract work that's already done in our schools. In order to continue this system, because the special education funding stream is not a sustainable funding stream for some of the same reasons of increasing costs elsewhere, in order to continue this level of service that keeps us in compliance with the Office of Civil Rights and Department of Justice, we need $25,000 a year to be able to fund this system.
And where is that sitting on page C18?
It's not located in the ESOL budget, Jackson.
Oh, it's not.
I opened
It's
the
in the-
deferred service,
Oh, it's in those, okay.
which is A17. Or no, it's in the mandated services, I'm sorry.
Yes.
A14.
Where does it fall in the budget?
It falls into the other wages components that are there.
Oh, so it is in their
It
budget,
is
the
in
other
part of that.
wages.
Yes, sir.
Oh, the 25, yeah, I'm sorry.
And again, this is an example of a mandate in good faith, an effort to really do something that's needed for families, but one that is certainly not funded by those who mandated it.
That's a very good way to put it. Not funded by those who mandate.
Funded by those who mandated it.
So this is both in-person interpretation and the translation of materials to either send home or post online on Blackboard or whatever.
Yes. Are there any questions?
Is this the last, are you moving
This
on?
is the last slide.
I had asked this question, and it may be a similar question I would pose to Kevin in special ed. So you said at one point in the monitoring, you track attendance, SOL data, and grades. So we're mandated to do standardized testing, preparation, and assessment. A significant amount of the time or the cost has to be preparing students for these standardized tests and then remediating them if they don't pass. If we were allowed to use alternative assessments in place of a standardized test and preparation, would that save us money?
Potentially. I think at that point, it would save mostly on tutoring at the high school levels, not necessarily in the ESOL budget. By the time students get to the SOL point, they are at the higher end of their language proficiency. So we don't allow students at the high school level, if that's what we're speaking about, to take the SOLs prior to at least being a level 3 because we know that they're not going to be successful. Within our ESOL program, we do not teach to the SOL test. We teach to the WIDA standards, which are the standards given to us by the state of Virginia for our ESOL program. The WIDA standards are very much focused on academic language connected to the different content areas that are tested by the SOLs. So it ends up being connected to the SOLs, but it's also connected to vocabulary, academic vocabulary, and language. And I would say that this test of the test is closer to our performance measures. The WIDA access test is a better test than the SOLs are. And so especially, I should say that the speaking piece and the writing piece. The reading piece, they're all 4 domains. The listening and the reading look more like multiple choice tests, but the speaking and the writing, the productive language pieces, are performance tasks. And they're very similar to the performance tasks that we give in our division, which I am happy about because it's a test that I feel like is a truer measure of deeper cognitive understanding. By the time students pass that test, they are ready to be successful in the mainstream curriculum.
Rusty, could you address for the board whether we have some leeway in the number of credits that are verified with an SLL test that a student that's an ESOL student would need in high school?
The same as everyone else, so we can give them locally verified credits, the same within social studies and science. That does not apply to our reading and math. And this has been a huge issue, and I don't know if we want to get into it, but if you could bring it up with the state, certainly there has been talk at the state level of allowing similar locally verified credits for ESOL students. We have a great number of students who work extremely hard. They come here speaking very little English. They do very well in their classes. Sometimes, literally, I know of one student that did not graduate because this student earned a 399 out of 400 on the SOL test. This student took that SOL test 12 times and still did not pass it, and made the choice to discontinue attending school as a result of that. So certainly, any kind of leeway we could get on alternative assessments for students, not that decrease the rigor, but that give them different ways of showing what they've learned in our schools, I think would be a great benefit to our kids.
So 1 point kept a child from graduating. Thank you.
Yes.
And do you want to address the, you know, like I said, I'm very concerned that there's nothing in the superintendent's request to advance our elementary language. And I'd like, you know, at least to have us move toward having another elementary school start down that process. And, you know, has there been interest from schools that would like to do this? You know, how much, you know, maybe you can't answer off the top of the head, would be a minimum for one school to start down that process?
We discussed this, and the minimum would really vary depending on the size of the school. We have had principals express an interest in moving forward if given the opportunity, with the understanding that it would require significant planning in order to get there. That if we were to move forward at one of our smaller schools, so a size of 400 or below, we could move forward with around $100,000, so between 1 and 1.5 FTEs, and then also considering some materials costs associated with that.
And I don't know whether there's consensus of the board for you to tighten those numbers up. I'd certainly be interested in seeing that.
General consensus? Seems like see heads nodding.
I thought it was a good idea.
Are there any other, yep.
Just with respect to what Steve just talked about, I thought, and my memory could well be failing me, I thought earlier in the year of last year when we did talk about, when we presented to the board information about world languages, we talked about at least doing the preliminary work to set up a procedure for how schools would be selected or how the languages would be selected. And I don't know if you've had the opportunity yet to start sketching that out.
We've begun that process. The understanding was that it would not be in this year's budget
Right,
cycle.
right.
And so we were planning that process so that a school could go through it and then be done with it by the time we enter into the next budget cycle. So we would have a very specific school that had already been vetted and have a clear plan for moving forward. And at that point, put it in the budget associated with a particular school that had been through this
Okay,
process.
okay. I'm just glad I didn't dream that. It really did happen. Thank you.
So when we think about this year, it would be possible to put a budget item in for less than 100,000, which we were thinking would be a teacher, because you could think about a planning year for a couple of schools where they might visit sites and do some professional development around that. So I think it depends on what you would have, what expectations you would have for the fall.
And I would have you keep in mind that in my looking at taking the assistant superintendent position, putting that into professional development and trying to add to that $58,000, that it's possible that what we could do would be to apportion some funding out of that to support this very specifically. That money won't go very far, so it probably should be tied to some very specific kinds of things that we think would be in the professional development realm.
I mean, that's, you know, even that little bit, would make me feel like, you know, this is something the board has put a high priority on and thinks is really critical to moving our system forward. And, you know, unfortunately, I have this history of the board wanting to do this, going back 16 years and always getting stonewalled, that no, we can't do it now. I'd like to see money being put toward it for next year.
How long will it take staff to come up with a budget item like that? How long will it?
I think it depends on how quickly we want to accelerate. If we would want to start a program at a school in the fall, we would go at about 1 or 1.5 teachers. If we want to do a planning year and having to go through the cycle that we were putting out in front as a process, I think it would be significantly less. So we can give you both.
See, I appreciate Steve's request, and I wouldn't mind seeing something like that, but I just don't want to see something that would be a pipe dream, you know? And I would hate to make y'all run around doing work on something that ultimately we couldn't do. I'm just not sure that would be efficient use of their time. You know, and so if it's worthwhile and you can do it in a couple of minutes, that's great. But if it's not going to be worthwhile and we can't do it, then we need to make that decision before we have staff run off and do this.
And I would say that if the proposal came for $50,000 or $100,000, I can see us voting to keep that, and maybe finding some other areas that are less critical to cut.
But at the same time, they would have to do the research to figure out what other areas, because there's still 3.1 million.
Yeah, I understand.
I would
So
also,
that's all I'm saying. If it's doable possibly, and the board agrees that it's doable possibly, then maybe it would be a good use of staff's
Right,
time.
and I do think the concept of planning rather than implementation, because when we do it, we want to do it right.
Well, the other piece I would say is once you go down that road with the school, I think you have a planning cost and then you have an implementation cost, and every year there would be a little bit more for just the one school. So I think we just have to remember that just what we would pay for next year doesn't necessarily pay for full implementation or language at a new elementary school.
So I would think a multi-year outlook. I want to enhance the program somehow. I agree with Steve, just keeping it the same. And even if I understood your presentation to us in the past, you can't really keep it the same. These students progress. And so, I mean, not to further complicate the issue, but what in your, make part of your analysis a recommendation of what in your opinion would be better for us. Expanding the program to another elementary school, or continuing it at Kale/Walton to keep the students that are currently in the program on track. And that would be the tough decision, I think.
We'll bring you both.
And if it's a planning, if you feel in your opinion you'll be rushing to implement it at another school in a year, you'd rather do planning, then I would rather spread those planning dollars across 2 elementary schools instead of just 1.
The point I'm making is there understanding or agreement on the board that we can do this in a year? We already have a budget that is already $3.1 million over, and I'm not saying I disagree, because I'm very strongly in favor of this.
Right, and what I'm just saying is that I think we have to have that proposal in front of us.
Yes, don't know yet.
We don't know yet, but I'm saying, I could very well see myself saying, well, I'd rather cut some positions from growth in order to support this.
I'd like it as an option.
So I want to, yeah,
But
the board will
if we
make
cut
that
positions
decision.
from growth, that means possibly increasing class size, which is something I know, Eric, you're not in favor of.
I know, but I want to be able to weigh those things. I mean, is expanding the foreign language program at the elementary school worth an additional student per class? Yeah, I have strong opinions, everybody has their opinions, but at least it'll be in front of us.
Yes.
So I think just like we're going to have some discussion, if we have to cut, what would we cut, and try to have some more conversation about that before the funding goes over. If there are areas that would be considered initiatives, like this would be, and then obviously if board members will put this forward, an idea of how to pay for it should be included, and then the board can discuss the options and see where it lands.
I think we all acknowledge it's going to aggravate the budget difference, but we really would like to see this program depicted somewhere in the plan.
Now, to the specific point of the ESOL, I want to remind us that something that is occurring is both HR strategy of hiring people in that are dual language, because you can immediately have an impact on a school without necessarily putting a program in place. So like what we're doing at Agner Hurt, out of sheer necessity, can still occur without necessarily us needing to do what we're talking about.
Right, and again, with Kale, with their immersion program, it's not, they can expand it to the next grade without additional cost, because they're using existing staff in a different way.
Well, I'm okay with seeing it. I wouldn't mind seeing it. I think one of the reasons we asked not to see it was because we didn't want to be enticed into, I recall we had this conversation.
Don't tempt us.
But I would be willing to see it. I'm just saying that if we do it, just like last year with the classrooms, the labs at Western Albemarle High School, I mean, we had to make decisions, and so that's what it's going to come to again, I imagine.
Well, in contrast to Western, though, starting a language program at a new school is different than funding a program we've already endorsed, which is Western.
True, but we have endorsed this program. I mean, this has been a program that's been on our radar for a very long time, and I think carrying it forward has also been on our radar as well. So it really, I mean, it's a similar situation.
You have a wider sweep of radar than I do. I've only been on here for 2 years. Second year.
Trust me. It's been on my radar for 14 years.
Are there any other questions or comments for Rusty?
Thanks.
Self-program? Well done, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good, Rusty.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Dr. Paul.
And for tonight's work session, Dr. Moran, is there another item on? Was there another piece that I'm not remembering?
I think that we're because we said that we were doing instruction part 1, part 2, so if you want to look at that calendar and see what we will be doing at the next session, that might be helpful to you, particularly if there's anything that you would like more of or less of. I know that Mr. Shivert will be on that evening, so here you go.
I guess the first thing I would ask is that tonight we had specific information brought forward. There were requests for further detailed information from that. Is there anything in addition from this evening that we need to ask for or board members wish to have?
Some of the charts I would like to have, actually.
To just put those
Well,
back.
to that point, because Jason brought this up at the break, I understand that there's going to be the presentation, the materials you use to present. A lot of times you need the last minute to get those ready. But I would appreciate having those loaded into the agenda so that while you're presenting them, board members can.
So there now. Somebody
Well,
place
the
it.
PowerPoints, so the PowerPoints in there.
Thanks, Jim.
If we could have those loaded ahead of the presentation, because I know that it's nice to flip back to the slides while you're going through it, if I can
Yes.
go back.
Well, and I will
In
tell you that.
addition, the public can follow along.
That's right, people that are listening, not just here, but also on our live stream, can pull that up and know what we're talking about as well. So I think it's a good point. The other piece that I would note is that on Tuesday night, we will be having our principals come in. If there are any specific questions that you have about school-based, it would be helpful if you don't have those right now, but you think about them as you look through the budget book, to please let Jackson know those so that we can make sure the principals are prepared to be able to address any of the things that you might have questions about related to school-based operations or staffing. Typically, you oftentimes don't see the principals until the end of the cycle. We're bringing them in up front because we think that it's important for you to have that opportunity while you're still fresh, and that we haven't gone through the entire budget book to really hear from the principals, because that is a big part of the process. And I know that there may be some questions you have specific to schools-based funding.
Now, are the principals literally the fourth ones on the agenda, or is that just?
I think that we can make that arrangement in any way that we want to.
Yeah, we should probably have them go first,
Yeah.
just so they can get out.
So they can get out and.
Yeah.
And we'll look at, what we'd like to be able to do is to show you the spreadsheet that we use, have them talk a little bit about how they approach staffing once they get their numbers. They're gonna get those tomorrow. So they'll have some of that, and they've got it in the budget notebook. And then you can really ask some good questions on how they approach that if they have to address changes that might come about because of the budget process.
And we also have really positioned HR with Comp and Ben up front, because that, again, is one of the things that I think that everybody's really interested in, both from the standpoint of the teacher workforce, our classified employees, our community, and you, because what we have this year is a very different approach by doing this half-year piece. And so I think that you may have some questions or some deep dive you want to take into that, as well as the benefits side, that will go deeper on that as well.
Can you, when we go into compensation benefits, can we have like an overview of the stipend process for different additional roles that teachers take on, you know, in their help with class, you know, as school elections, different, you know, all the different roles, clubs and stuff that they help facilitate.
Coaches?
In a sense, they're kind of coaches, aren't they?
Coaches
Do you
too.
mean athletic coaches?
Well, athletics is its own.
But you're gonna give us that in the athletics, right?
Yeah.
But we can ask Lauren to just talk about that process and answer questions.
Even at the principals, I think it'd be fine for the principals to touch on that too.
Didn't we cut the amount we paid for stipends?
By a third.
Got third.
Third.
By a third. So I'd like to have, you know, this is what these positions were paid then and what they paid then.
You know, the thing is, there's only so much cuts that you can make to stipends, and when, you know, the teachers are doing that extra, so they do deserve to be paid for that. So if we've already cut stipends, how much more can we cut stipends, right?
I think that they are very minimal in terms of the amount of time that teachers put into those. So I certainly would see that as an area that would be difficult to go back to. So but we will bring forward the process for that. The other thing I wanted to note is, Mr. Zimmerman, if you can just note in response to the question about line items, I know that you.
We will get those line items. We're intending on providing those out to all board members tomorrow.
What's in instruction part 2, and then what's under the principals?
So what we plan on doing on Tuesday night under that part is tonight we talked about some programs. We thought that what we would do Tuesday night is get down more to the school level around how they staff.
So that would be in instruction part 2
Right.
and with the principals. Okay.
The principals will be the
So
ones
follow
that
along.
talk through that a little bit and answer
Okay.
questions. And again, I think that's critical because, you know, when it comes down to it and you're discussing class size and whether or not to fund FTE for growth, I think it's good to hear from the people on the front line as to how they address the changes that get made. Because last year, I think that was a piece when it came down to it, when the board was wrestling with that, making decisions. You made the decision, and then the principals go out and make it happen, and then in the aftermath, you're kind of wondering, well, how did they make that happen? I think this time, hearing from them up front how they would address changes if they were made will be more helpful to you going through the process.
So I would imagine that there could be some healthy conversation around growth, around Comp and Ben, around technology. We've asked Mr. Scheibert to really be able to do some breakout with that for you. So that's going to be a pretty time-intensive evening in terms of our work that night.
Right. Would it be appropriate for the principals to address if they were going to reprioritize the budget the superintendents come up with her recommendations of how to make these adjustments, weigh these different things, how they might choose to weigh things differently, including maybe even the staffing formula.
Everybody typically weighs in by the end of the budget season on everything anyway, so I have no problems with that.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that
I mean, that puts them kind of on the spot.
yes, and that's okay, but I think that one of the things that the principals bring to the picture is a real boots on the ground perspective. And I feel like that they are really great advocates for both their children in their schools as well as for the educators that serve them. So I hope that we're able to have a pretty healthy conversation about what things are on their minds. And as always, expecting them to very freely share with you their perspectives.
I had a principal a few months ago tell me that the shortage of resources in central office was hurting her ability to do her job. And she was thinking she almost would want to give up some of her staff to beef up central office. I've never heard a principal say that.
Me It's
I would hope that just make sure Warren is aware on the, so I would appreciate it being extremely clear what the plan changes are for the healthcare and then the dollar amounts for the spousal piece going on. So that when we went through with the joint boards, it was always for planning purposes and for the 5-year plan and the strategies and all of that. So I wanted to be clear that this is what's happening in the current request, that had the information on hand to be able to do them.
Yes, sir, we'll make sure that's covered.
and we will come back and make sure that we get some real clarity on, we had some conversation over the step out break about the FTE piece that Stevie brought up. So we want to make sure that we also, and that fits very nicely with the Tuesday night as well. Thank you.
Very good. This is actually time for public comment, the normal public comment time. Has anybody signed up for public comment? Is there anybody here that wishes to give public comment? Public comment is now closed.